It was late October when I went up to the cabin with two friends. The air had that sharp, dry chill that comes before winter, and the forest floor was covered in brown pine needles and fallen leaves. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far enough that you couldn't hear cars, planes, or anything human. It was the kind of quiet that makes your own footsteps sound too loud. The cabin itself was small, built in the 70s, the kind of place you could tell hadn't been used much lately. Dust on the windowsills, mouse droppings in the corners, and that musty smell that wood gets when it's been sitting cold and damp for too long. It belonged to my friend's uncle, who said we could use it for the weekend. There was no electricity, no phone signal, just a wood stove and a few kerosene lamps that still worked. We spent the first night sitting by the fire, drinking beer, and listening to the wind moving through the trees outside. The forest out there was thick, full of dense pine and birch, with narrow animal trails cutting through in every direction. When you stepped outside at night, the darkness felt solid, like stepping into a wall. The next morning, after breakfast, we decided to explore the woods behind the cabin. The air was cold enough that our breath hung in front of us, and the forest smelled like wet dirt and sap. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The trees grew close together, and even though it was daylight, it still felt dim. After about half an hour of walking, we found something that made us all stop. At first, I thought it was a person standing against one of the trees. The figure was tall, dressed in old camouflage hunting clothes, faded jacket, torn pants, and a hat pulled low over its face. It was standing upright, its head tilted slightly forward. For a second, I thought maybe it was someone out hunting, but something about it looked off. It wasn't moving, not even a twitch. We got closer, and that's when I saw it clearly. It wasn't a person at all. It was a mannequin, a full-sized mannequin like the kind you see in department stores, only older. The face was blank, pale plastic that had been scratched and dirted over time. The eyes were just painted black dots, worn almost completely off. The clothes looked like they'd been sitting out there for years, stained, sun-faded, stiff with age. The jacket had a big tear near the shoulder, and one sleeve was shredded, like something had clawed at it. It was propped up carefully against the tree, not just tossed there. Someone had placed it intentionally. Its arms were positioned straight down at its sides, and its legs were slightly bent at the knees, as if it were resting. There was something deeply wrong about the way it stood there, almost human but not alive. The forest around it was completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. I remember the way the air felt, still and heavy, like the whole forest was waiting. There was a strange smell too, faint but sharp, something like old metal or wet leather. I tried to brush it off, but it lingered. The ground near the mannequin was littered with small objects. Rusty cans, bits of old rope, broken glass, and a single hunting boot lying on its side. It looked like someone had used this spot for something years ago, but what exactly, I couldn't tell. There were marks on the tree behind it too. Long, thin scratches running down the bark, almost parallel, as if someone had dragged a knife or nails down the trunk. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who would drag a life-sized mannequin into the woods and dress it up like that? Why leave it standing against a tree in the middle of nowhere? The longer I looked, the more unsettling it felt. The way the faded hat cast a shadow over the blank face made it look like it was staring straight ahead. And even though I knew it was just a mannequin, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching. We eventually turned back toward the cabin, but I kept glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The forest felt different after that, like something unseen had woken up. Back at the cabin, the mood had changed. None of us really wanted to talk about it. It wasn't that we were scared exactly, but there was this strange tension, like a weight pressing down on the air. The woods around the cabin felt tighter, closer, and every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see that mannequin standing somewhere nearby. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low, and the shadows moved across the walls in slow patterns. The wind had picked up outside, and the old cabin creaked with every gust. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about that figure standing out there in the dark. At some point, I got up to use the bathroom and decided to peek out the window. The moon was bright enough to light the clearing, and for a second, I thought I saw something between the trees. A shape faint and still. I told myself it was just a stump or a trick of the light. But even after I looked away, I couldn't shake the image. The next morning, I went out early, before the others woke up. The forest was quiet again, and the cold air stung my face. I walked back toward where we'd found the mannequin. The walk felt longer this time, and every step made me more uneasy. When I reached the spot, my stomach dropped. The mannequin was gone. The ground where it had been standing still had the marks of its boots pressed into the dirt. The tree still had the scratches, the cans, the boot, but the mannequin wasn't there. There were faint drag marks in the dirt leading away from the tree, heading deeper into the woods. They stopped after about 20 feet, swallowed up by pine needles. I stood there for a long time, scanning the forest, trying to spot any sign of it. Nothing moved, but I had the strongest feeling I've ever had in my life that I was being watched. It wasn't panic. It was that slow, crawling kind of fear that makes the back of your neck tighten. I turned around and walked back to the cabin without stopping. The sound of my boots crunching on the ground seemed too loud, echoing between the trees. When I got back, the others were just waking up. I didn't say much, just told them we should pack up early. I didn't mention what I saw or what I didn't see. We left before noon, driving the long dirt road back to the highway. As the cabin disappeared behind us, I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see something standing in the treeline. I didn't, but I also didn't feel relief. For weeks after that trip, I couldn't stop thinking about that mannequin. The way it was positioned, the way it disappeared without a trace. It wasn't just some random junk someone dumped. Someone had put it there for a reason. Someone had dressed it, propped it up, and later, someone had come back for it. A few months later, out of curiosity, I looked up that area online. The nearest town had a handful of old reports from years back. Strange vandalism, missing tools from hunting shacks, a few accounts of weird setups found in the forest. One post from a hiker mentioned finding a figure tied to a tree, wearing a hunter's cap, deep in those same woods. I never went back to that cabin. None of us did. But sometimes I think about the person who set that mannequin up, the care they took to dress it, the way they positioned it like a person resting against a tree. I think about how it was gone the next day, and how I never heard a sound that night even though it had to have been moved somehow. Every now and then, when I'm driving on back roads through wooded areas, I'll glance out the window and catch sight of something, just for a split second. A shape in the trees standing too still, too straight. And every time, I get that same cold feeling deep in my chest. Because now I know that somewhere out there, maybe deep in another forest, someone is still dragging that mannequin around, dressing it, propping it up, and leaving it for whoever stumbles across it next. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any town or paved road. It took almost 40 minutes of driving on an old gravel trail to get there, and even longer to get a signal on my phone once we arrived. The place was small, single-story, with wood that had darkened over years of rain and sun. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, their tops so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground in the late afternoon. The air was cold even though it was early autumn, and the smell of wet leaves clung to everything. I come there to be alone. The idea was to spend a few nights off-grid, no phone, no noise, no distractions. The cabin belonged to a coworker's family, and they rarely used it anymore. It came with a wood stove, a small bed, an old refrigerator that barely worked, and one single-pane window in the bedroom that faced the woods. The first day was quiet and slow. I arrived before noon, unpacked, stacked the firewood that had been left beside the shed, and made coffee on a small gas stove. The silence of the forest took a while to get used to. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a city when the power goes out. It was heavier, thicker, like the trees swallowed every sound. Even the air felt still. By evening, the temperature dropped fast. I built a small fire inside and watched the shadows move along the walls. There was something both peaceful and unnerving about being out there alone. Every creak of the old wood sounded louder than it should. Around 10 p.m., I stepped outside to take a leak and was hit by how dark it was. The trees looked like solid walls, and the stars barely broke through the canopy. You couldn't see 5 feet ahead without a flashlight. I remember standing there for a few seconds longer than I should have, feeling watched, even though I told myself that was just the isolation getting to me. I went to bed around midnight, the fire burning low in the stove. The air was dry, and I left the window cracked open a couple inches to keep it from getting too stuffy. The forest outside was completely still. No wind, no movement, nothing. Sometime later, I didn't know what time exactly, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a sound that woke me at first. It was just that feeling, that cold awareness that something isn't right. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was filled with a faint orange glow. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out why I was awake. Then I heard it, a whisper. It came from outside, faint but clear, drifting through the small crack of the open window. Just one word, outside. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the silence. The kind of sound that makes your body go cold before your mind even catches up. It wasn't a shout, not even a voice raised in anger, just a low, steady whisper that sounded too close, like someone standing just beneath the window. I froze. My first thought was that I must have dreamed it, that my half-asleep brain had played a trick. But my heart was already pounding hard, my skin prickling. I waited, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for any other sound. The whisper didn't repeat. All I could hear was my own breathing, the faint crackle from the dying fire, and the occasional pop of the wood. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtain was open halfway. A strip of darkness showed between the fabric and the glass. I couldn't see anything beyond it, just blackness. My instinct told me to get up and close it, but my body wouldn't move. I kept listening. Nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 20. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up. My throat felt dry, and every movement sounded loud. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stood. I reached for the flashlight on the small table beside the bed and clicked it on. The light beam hit the far wall, then the door, then the window. I walked to the window slowly and shut it all the way. Then I locked it, just in case. The glass was cold under my hand. I stood there for a while, staring out into the dark. The forest was motionless, but my eyes kept searching, waiting for a shape to move. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, standing just beyond the light from the cabin. After a few minutes, I went back to bed. I lay on my side, facing the window, the flashlight still in my hand. My heart didn't slow down for a long time. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow sleep because when I opened my eyes again, the faint light of dawn was just starting to come through the curtains. I stayed in bed for a while, trying to convince myself it had just been a dream. Maybe I had heard the wind or an animal. Maybe my brain had made it into a whisper. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. When I finally got up, I checked the cabin inside and out. The ground outside the window was soft from the rain a few days before. I crouched down to look closer and saw it. 2 clear footprints in the dirt just below the window. Bare feet. You could see the toes, the arch, the heel. The prints were small, but not childlike. More like an adult's, but narrow, almost delicate. The earth around them was slightly disturbed, as if someone had stood there for a while, shifting their weight. I followed the prints for a few feet, but they stopped abruptly at the tree line. The ground there was covered in pine needles, and the trail disappeared completely. All morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whisper, the prints, the way it had sounded so close. Someone had walked up to that window in the middle of the night and whispered a single word to me. Outside. The thought made my stomach twist. It wasn't a random thing to say. It felt deliberate, like a command or an invitation. I started to wonder what would have happened if I had gotten up right then. What I would have seen if I'd looked out. By noon, I'd already decided to leave a day early. I packed my gear fast, checking every corner of the cabin as I moved. Nothing seemed disturbed, nothing missing. But the unease wouldn't leave me. Before I locked up, I looked around one last time. The forest was completely still again, the same heavy silence hanging in the air. The drive back to the main road felt longer than it had coming in. Every time the trees opened up enough to show glimpses of the sky, I felt relief. It wasn't until I reached cell service again that I started to feel like I could breathe properly. That night, back home, I couldn't stop replaying the sound in my head. The whisper wasn't random noise, it had a human tone to it. Calm, low, intentional, like someone had known exactly what they wanted to say and exactly how quietly to say it. A few days later, I mentioned the cabin to my coworker, just casually. I didn't tell him about the whisper, just asked if anyone ever stayed there recently. He said no, not in years. It used to be used by his uncle for hunting, but nobody had gone there since the man passed away. The place didn't even have neighbors for miles. He laughed when I said it felt isolated, told me that's why most people stopped going. But he mentioned something else, something that made my stomach drop. He said his uncle once caught someone camping in the woods nearby, a drifter who'd been living rough out there for weeks. The man had been stealing supplies from empty cabins, sneaking in when no one was home. He'd been arrested, but after a few months, he disappeared again. I never told him about the whisper or the footprints, but I knew what I'd heard, and I knew what I'd seen. Someone had been standing right outside that window, watching me sleep, waiting for me to wake up enough to hear them. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had listened. If I'd gotten up, opened the door, stepped outside like that voice told me to, would they have run off? Or would I have seen someone standing just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting? It's been years since that night, but sometimes, when the wind slips through my apartment window in the middle of the night, I still hear that same faint sound in my head, the slow draw of breath before the whisper, the single word carried through the dark. And every time I do, I make sure the windows are shut tight, because whoever whispered that word once had probably done it before, and maybe they're still out there waiting for someone else to listen. It was early September when we rented the old cabin near the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest. The drive there was long, quiet, and full of narrow turns through heavy trees that pressed close on both sides of the road. It had rained that morning, and by the time we reached the cabin, everything smelled damp and earthy. Pine needles, wet soil, and the faint metallic scent of rain on old wood. The place sat at the end of a dirt driveway surrounded by tall spruce trees. There were no neighbors, no visible roads, just the cabin and the forest stretching endlessly behind it. The cabin was small and old but solid dark wood floors, a single bedroom, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a front porch facing the trees and a shed sitting about 30 yards behind the house. The place had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no cable, just a radio that barely picked up any signal. It was exactly the kind of place you go to when you want to be away from everything. We brought enough supplies for 4 days. Canned food, a couple of coolers with drinks, meat, eggs and milk, and a lot of snacks. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, set up the sleeping bags, started a fire, and made dinner. The woods outside were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. I'd grown up camping, and there's usually at least some background noise, crickets, frogs, wind, but here there was almost nothing. The silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. That night I remember hearing small noises outside, soft cracks, faint rustling, but I brushed them off as normal forest sounds. Animals, maybe, a raccoon or a deer. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire popping and the wind moving faintly through the trees. The second day, we hiked a few miles down a trail that ran behind the cabin. It wasn't well marked, and a lot of fallen branches made it hard to follow. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, like the forest was swallowing sound. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by the damp ground. We came back in the late afternoon, tired and hungry, and made dinner on the old stove. That night, I packed the cooler full of food and drinks and left it inside, near the kitchen counter. It was a heavy-duty cooler, the kind with metal latches and a tight seal. I remember specifically locking the cabin door before bed. There were 2 locks on it, one old brass key lock and a newer bolt lock. I checked both before lying down. There were no windows open, no gaps big enough for animals to squeeze through. Felt secure. The night was colder. The fire burned low, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and wet pine. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like something sliding or scraping softly against wood. Not constant, but just once, long and slow. Then silence again. I lay still, listening. The cabin creaked every now and then, as old buildings do, and the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, the cabin was cold. Light came in faintly through the small windows, hitting the dust in the air. I went to start breakfast and reached for the cooler and froze. The lid was wide open, completely upright. The inside was empty, not just partly, completely stripped clean. Every package of food, every bottle, every piece of ice, gone. The inside was dry, no melted water, no trash, nothing, just the faint smell of what used to be there. The first thing I did was look at the door, still locked, both bolts still in place, windows, all closed. There was no sign of anything being forced open. No scratches, no broken glass, nothing. The floor near the cooler had faint smudges on it, like dirt or old mud, but the prints were too faint to make out any shape. I checked every inch of the cabin, but nothing else was touched. The cabinets, the bags, the backpacks, all untouched. Just the cooler, empty, lid open. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. A raccoon couldn't have done that. A bear couldn't have gotten inside without damage. No animal could open a sealed cooler inside a locked cabin and leave no mess. The more I looked around, the less sense it made. We decided to search around the outside. The ground was soft from the previous day's rain, and near the porch steps, there were faint impressions in the mud. They weren't clear footprints, more like uneven ovals, as if someone had walked through with bare feet and half the marks had washed away. They led from the trees to the porch, stopped near the door, and then disappeared. I followed them as far as I could into the woods, but they vanished into the moss and pine needles after a few yards. All morning I kept replaying everything in my head. I knew for a fact that door had been locked. I checked it twice before bed. There was no sign anyone had broken in, but someone or something had been inside that cabin. And they hadn't taken money, electronics, or any valuables. Just food. The rest of the day I couldn't relax. Every sound outside made me tense. The forest didn't feel quiet anymore, it felt watchful. Like the trees themselves were holding something back. I noticed small details that didn't register before. A cigarette but half buried near the edge of the porch, a broken twig at shoulder height near the door, the faint smell of something musky and human near the window frame. It felt like someone had been close, maybe watching us while we slept. That evening, I kept the lanterns lit longer than usual. I didn't want darkness inside. The thought of sleeping in that cabin another night made my stomach twist, but we decided to stay until morning. The nearest town was an hour's drive down winding roads, and driving those at night wasn't safe. It was hard to fall asleep. Every creak, every shift of wind outside made me sit up. Around 1 a.m., I heard something again. Soft, deliberate steps on the porch. Slow, careful. Then a faint tap like a fingertip brushing wood. I held my breath. The sound moved from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. The silence after was unbearable. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, waiting for another noise that never came. When morning finally came, I went outside immediately. The porch boards were damp with dew, but near the railing, there were two faint smudges, marks that looked like hands pressed against the wood. Not clear prints, just the suggestion of fingers. Below them, the same faint barefoot impressions led back toward the trees. We packed everything as fast as we could. I didn't even bother checking the shed or the creek. I just wanted to leave that place behind. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something strange near the back of the cabin. There was a small pile of trash, empty food wrappers, crumpled cans, and pieces of plastic. All of it was ours, the same items that had been in the cooler. They were torn open and scattered like someone had sat there eating through them one by one. The pile was about 20 yards from the cabin, half hidden behind a fallen tree. The grass around it was flattened in a rough oval, as if someone had been sitting there for a long time. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to see anything else. The drive out of those woods felt endless. The farther we got from that cabin, the lighter I felt, like some invisible weight was being peeled away. When we finally reached the main road, the world looked normal again. Open sky, sunlight, traffic. But even then, my mind kept going back to the same thought. Someone had been inside that cabin while we slept. There was no damage, no theft, no violence. Just food taken and wrappers left behind. Someone who knew how to open the door quietly, who knew where to look, and who had no interest in anything else. It was almost like they'd been living nearby, watching, waiting for a chance to eat. Later that week, I looked up the cabin's listing online and found a few old reviews buried deep in the site. One mentioned strange signs of someone staying around the property. Another said, missing food, no break-in. Nobody ever explained it further. I haven't gone back to that area since. Every time I think about that empty cooler, I imagine someone standing just outside that door, listening to us sleep, quietly letting themselves in, eating in the dark and slipping out before dawn. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person, hungry, quiet, and close enough to touch the doorknob. It's easy to forget how alone you really are in a place like that until something reminds you. And I still wonder, even now, how many nights before ours that same person might have stood there in the dark, waiting for another unlocked door, another cooler full of food, another group that wouldn't notice until morning. It was late October when we drove up to the cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. The drive took nearly 5 hours from the city, and by the time we reached the old gravel road that led to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip low behind the ridges. The forest there was dense, endless rows of pine and cedar with moss-covered trunks and hardly any sound except the distant call of crows. The road was rough and narrow, just 2 strips of worn dirt cutting through the trees. Every bump made the car creak. You could tell not many people came out that way anymore. The cabin was small and old, built from dark, weathered logs that looked like they'd been standing there for decades. It sat at the base of a hill, about half a mile from a small creek that we could hear when the wind shifted. There was no cell service, no neighbors in sight, and no light from any other homes. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unnerving. We were only planning to stay for a long weekend, 3 nights, to get some quiet before winter set in. The first night was calm. We unpacked, got the wood stove going, and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp and cold, and the smell of pine smoke filled the small cabin. I remember stepping outside before bed to breathe in the air and look at the stars. There were so many, it almost hurt to look at them. But beyond the beauty of it, there was this heavy silence. Not the kind of silence you get in the city at night, but a total absence of noise. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The next morning, the sun came up gray and dull behind a thin layer of clouds. The temperature had dropped overnight, and frost covered the grass and the hood of the car. The cabin's porch creaked as I stepped out to start the generator. I walked around the side of the cabin, and the ground was soft and damp with dew. There were deer tracks near the tree line, maybe from the night before. That kind of thing didn't bother me. The woods are full of signs of life if you know where to look. We spent most of that day hiking, following an old logging trail that led up into the hills behind the cabin. The trail was narrow and uneven, and fallen branches blocked sections of it. We didn't go too far because it started getting dark early, and the woods grew colder the higher we climbed. When we got back, the air felt heavier, almost like the forest was waiting for something. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The fire had burned down, and the only sound was the wind pressing softly against the cabin walls. I could hear something faint outside, like gravel crunching, slow, uneven. I stayed still, listening, and then it stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal wandering close to the cabin, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went out to the car to grab a few things, and I noticed something odd. There were marks in the dirt near the back of the vehicle. Not tire marks or animal prints. Just long, shallow scuffs, like something had been dragged. Could have been from when we unloaded, but I didn't remember dragging anything that heavy. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid, and went on with the day. We spent the second day cutting up some firewood and exploring a small clearing down near the creek. The air had that cold, metallic taste that comes before a storm, and by evening the sky was dark with clouds. When night fell, it rained steadily for hours. The sound of it on the roof was steady and loud enough to drown out everything else. When I stepped out to check the generator around midnight, I noticed the smell of gasoline faintly in the air. It wasn't leaking from the generator. It smelled more like it was coming from somewhere near the car. I shined my flashlight around but didn't see anything out of place. The rain was coming down hard enough that visibility was poor, and I didn't feel like standing out there any longer than I had to. I went back inside and tried to shake it off, but there was this growing unease that I couldn't explain. The final morning, we woke up early to pack. The sky was overcast and colorless, the kind of gray that makes the whole forest look dead. We were tired and ready to leave. I stepped outside first, loaded a few bags into the trunk, and then did a quick walk around the car out of habit. That's when I saw it. On the rear passenger tire, something shiny caught my eye. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt and wet leaves, and my stomach sank. A large nail, thick, rusty, and old, was jammed deep into the rubber. It wasn't some small nail from a construction site either. It was a long, square-headed nail, the kind used in old woodwork, almost like something from the cabin itself. The head was large, and the way it was lodged into the tire didn't look like an accident. It was driven in at an angle, deep enough that it couldn't have just fallen there. The nail hadn't been there when we arrived. I remember clearly checking the tires on the first day when we parked, because the road had so many sharp rocks and I didn't want to get stranded. The tires were fine then. I ran my hand around the others just to be sure, but that one was the only one damaged. The more I looked at it, the more it felt deliberate, like someone had placed it there, waited, and pushed it in when we wouldn't notice. The tire was flat enough that we couldn't drive far, so we had to use the spare. The process took a while because the ground was uneven and cold. As I crouched there replacing it, I noticed something else. Footprints in the mud beside the car. Not boot prints like ours. These were smaller, more narrow, and bare. You could see the outline of toes pressed into the wet ground. They led from the direction of the trees straight toward the back of the car. That was the moment everything clicked together in my head. The dragging marks I'd seen earlier, the smell of gas, the noise in the night. Someone had been around the cabin while we were asleep. Maybe more than once. Maybe watching. Maybe waiting. I felt a chill crawl down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. We didn't linger. We finished packing, threw everything in the trunk, and got into the car as fast as possible. As I backed out, I kept looking at the edge of the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the same cold, wet forest staring back. The drive back down that mountain road felt longer than the drive up. Every sound of gravel crunching under the tires made my nerves tighten. Once we hit the highway, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. But the whole ride home, I kept thinking about that nail. It wasn't random. There was no reason for a nail like that to be out there. No reason for it to end up buried deep in our tire unless someone put it there. Maybe it was some local who didn't want people coming near that cabin anymore. Maybe they'd been watching us from the woods, waiting for us to leave so they could make sure we wouldn't come back. Or maybe they had other plans if we'd stayed another night. A week later, I looked up the property online. The cabin hadn't been rented in over a year before us. The owner lived out of state and only visited once every few summers. That part of the mountain wasn't near any active homes or even campsites. Whoever was out there that weekend had no reason to be there except for us. That nail is still in my garage. I kept it after we replaced the tire. It's dark with rust, thick, and heavy. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe as proof to myself that it actually happened. Every time I look at it, I think about how easily that could have gone wrong. If the tire had gone flat on that mountain road, we would have been stuck miles from help, no service, no passing cars. And whoever had been out there watching would have known exactly where we were. The cabin looked peaceful when we first arrived. Quiet, untouched, safe. But by the time we left, I realized how vulnerable that kind of isolation really makes you. Out there, surrounded by miles of forest and silence, you don't hear someone walking up behind you. You don't hear the sound of a nail being driven into a tire. You don't hear anything until it's too late. I haven't gone back to a cabin since that trip. The memory of that morning, the cold air, the gray sky, and that nail buried deep in the rubber, never left me. It wasn't nature or bad luck that caused it. It was someone's hands, someone who wanted us stuck out there. And that thought still keeps me awake some nights, wondering how close they really got while we were sleeping. I had spent the weekend alone at a small, off-grid cabin deep in the mountains of Montana. It was something I'd been meaning to do for months, just to disconnect completely, to see if I could go a few days without my phone or any kind of noise. The cabin was old but in decent shape, a one-room structure with a cot, a wood stove, and a small table by a window that looked out toward a dense slope of pine trees. No cell service, no running water, no electricity except for a single solar lamp. It was about 5 miles from where I'd parked my truck at a small turnout off an unmarked forest road. The only access was a narrow hiking trail that wound uphill for most of the way, over roots and rocks and the occasional stream crossing. I'd arrived on Friday evening, right before sunset. The air had that early autumn bite to it, cold enough to make your breath visible, but not freezing. I spent most of that first night just getting settled, lighting the stove, unpacking my small cooler, and making sure the cabin didn't have any leaks or broken windows. It was quiet, aside from the wind pushing through the trees outside and the occasional creak from the wood settling. The stillness was comforting in a strange way. Saturday came and went slowly. I went for a few short hikes around the area, took photos, and sat out on the porch watching the shadows change as the sun moved. There wasn't much to do, and that was the point. I wanted to be bored. I wanted to feel what that kind of silence was like again. The only signs of anyone else ever being there were a few old fire pits and a faded Forest Service marker nailed to a tree nearby. That night, I cooked a simple meal and went to bed early. I woke up once in the middle of the night because of a noise outside. Not loud, but distinct. It sounded like crunching footsteps in the dry pine needles. It came and went quickly, so I assumed it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon passing by. Still, it kept me awake for a while, listening. The woods are strange at night. Your ears start making things out of nothing, and every little crack sounds closer than it really is. By morning, I decided to pack up early and head back to my truck. It was still dim when I stepped out onto the trail, the kind of gray light you get before sunrise. The forest was wet with dew, and the ground smelled like cold soil and moss. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, adjusted my jacket, and started down the path. The trail was quiet. I didn't hear any birds, which was odd. Usually there's some kind of noise, distant caws, the flap of wings, but that morning, it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. The only sound was the soft crunch of my boots on the trail and the shifting of my pack straps. After maybe 2 miles, the trail dipped through a small valley where the trees opened up slightly. I remember feeling relieved that I was making good time. The air was colder there, and I could see my breath again. That's when I saw someone else ahead of me, a hiker coming from the opposite direction, maybe 30 yards away. At first, I was surprised. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd parked my truck 2 days earlier. The man was walking at an even pace, head down, with a steady stride. He looked like any other hiker, until I noticed what he was wearing. It took me a second to process it. He had the same dark green jacket as mine, the same faded tan backpack, the same kind of hiking boots with that same scuffed patch on the right toe. Even his pants looked identical, the same color and wear marks at the knees. He moved in the same rhythm I did, the same way my arms swung when I walked. It was strange, like looking at a reflection that had come to life. I slowed my pace, thinking maybe I was imagining the similarities. The light was dim and filtered through the trees, so I thought maybe I was just seeing what I expected to see. Another hiker dressed for the cold, nothing more. But as I got closer, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. His backpack had the same brand logo, the same small tear on the right shoulder strap. I had made that tear myself last summer when a branch snagged it during a hike near Yellowstone. My stomach dropped. I stopped walking. The man looked up briefly, as if noticing me at the same time, but I couldn't make out his face clearly. It was shadowed by the brim of his hood. He didn't stop, though. He just kept walking toward me, calm, steady, like it was completely normal. I don't know why, but a cold wave of panic moved through me. There was something about the way he carried himself that felt off, like he was mimicking me. My instincts kicked in and I turned slightly, ready to step off the trail to give him room to pass. But the moment I glanced down for half a second to find my footing and looked back up, he was gone. Not in a gradual, disappearing behind a tree way, just gone. The trail stretched ahead, clear and empty. I stood there for a long time, scanning the path, the trees, the slope to the right where the trail curved. There was nowhere he could have gone without me hearing the brush move. No side trail, no sound of footsteps fading away, just silence. I told myself I must have been overtired, that maybe the dim light and the quiet had gotten into my head. It happens out there, your brain fills in shapes and people that aren't really there. I forced myself to keep walking, but I couldn't shake the unease. The woods suddenly felt heavier. Every sound, every shift of wind through the branches made me tense up. As I got closer to where I'd parked, the ground started to get muddier. It had rained a little overnight, leaving patches of soft earth that clearly showed footprints. I could see my own tracks from when I'd hiked in 2 days earlier, deep prints heading toward the cabin. I followed them automatically, half comforted by the idea that I could trace my steps back. But then I noticed something that made me stop cold. There were other prints alongside mine, fresh ones, the same boot tread as mine, same size, same spacing, but they were pressed on top of my older prints, newer, clearer, more defined. They followed right behind mine for as far as I could see. Sometimes they overlapped almost perfectly, like whoever had made them had been stepping exactly where I had before. My first thought was that maybe someone had come up the trail after me, another hiker wearing similar gear. But the tracks followed every turn, every uneven rock, every side step I'd taken to avoid puddles. The pattern matched my gait, stride for stride, like someone had studied the way I walked and repeated it. I crouched down to look closer. The prints were fresh, maybe an hour old at most. The edges were sharp, the soil still damp inside them. Whoever had made them had been behind me recently. I scanned the trees around me, listening hard. Nothing, just the wind and the faint creak of branches high above. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down again, and a strange thought crept in, that maybe I hadn't imagined that man on the trail. Maybe he had stepped off for a moment and followed behind me afterward. I picked up my pace, my pulse rising with every step. The trail began to slope upward, the last half mile before the parking area. My breathing was loud in my ears, and I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I didn't want to. Every time I looked, the trail was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees, I almost felt relieved. The morning light had grown brighter now, casting thin beams through the forest canopy. I reached the truck, unlocked the door, and threw my pack into the passenger seat. Before climbing in, I turned around one last time to look back down the trail. The prints were there, 2 sets, mine and the ones that followed. They stopped right at the edge of the clearing where the truck sat. No sign of anyone else, just those identical boot prints ending a few feet away from my bumper, facing directly toward where I stood. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. The longer I stared down the trail, the more I realized how strange it all was. Whoever that person was, if it was a person at all, they had somehow known my exact route, my pace, my timing. They had followed right behind me, wearing everything I was wearing, down to the smallest detail. When I finally pulled onto the dirt road and drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror for miles, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees behind me. But the trail stayed empty, swallowed back up by the woods. I haven't gone back since. I still have the same boots and jacket, but every time I see them, I remember that morning, that quiet stretch of trail, the cold air, and the prints that matched my own all the way back to my truck. It wasn't a ghost story or some trick of the light. Someone was there. Someone who wanted to look exactly like me. And for at least part of that hike, they were only a few steps behind. The cabin had been in my family for as long as I could remember. My grandfather built it back in the 1960s, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, where the trees grow thick and the nights stretch longer than they should. It was originally used for hunting trips, but after he passed, no one went there much anymore. My dad stopped going when he got older, and my brothers moved out of state. It sat empty most of the time, except for the rare weekends when someone wanted a quiet place to get away. I hadn't been there in almost a decade, but that winter I decided to take a long weekend for myself. I'd been working non-stop, and the idea of total silence sounded perfect. No phone signal, no neighbors, just me and the snow and the creaking wood stove. I left on a Friday afternoon, drove 4 hours north, and arrived just before dusk. The last mile of the road wasn't plowed, so I had to park by the gate and hike the rest of the way in with my pack and a sled for supplies. The air was sharp and cold enough to sting. My breath came out in clouds, and the snow was untouched except for old deer tracks crossing the path. When the cabin came into view, dark against the white woods, it looked smaller than I remembered. The porch roof sagged slightly, and the windows were fogged from the inside. The place always had that half-forgotten feeling, like time didn't move the same way out there. Inside, everything was just as we'd left it. Old plaid curtains, a cracked stone fireplace, 2 wooden chairs by the window, and the same woven rug that had been there since I was a kid. The air smelled faintly of ash and pine sap. I started a fire, unpacked, and settled in. The first night was uneventful. The wind pushed against the walls a few times, and I could hear branches snapping outside under the weight of the snow. The sound of it all, the pops and groans of the wood, the faint scratching of pine needles against the roof, was something I'd forgotten I missed. I fell asleep early, wrapped in 2 blankets on the old cot near the fire. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. At first, I couldn't tell why. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was cold. The kind of cold that feels like it's pressing down on you. I lay there for a moment, eyes open, trying to adjust to the dark. That's when I heard it. A soft, deliberate scratching sound coming from the front door. It was slow, uneven, like something dragging across wood. Scratch, pause, scratch. My first thought was that it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog sniffing around. It wasn't unusual. The cabin was surrounded by forest, and I'd seen plenty of tracks earlier that day. But this sound felt different, too controlled, too steady. It wasn't frantic or random like an animal pawing. It was long, slow, intentional. I propped myself up on one elbow and listened. The noise came again, a little louder this time. Scratch, drag, scratch. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute. My pulse started to thump in my ears. I told myself not to overthink it, that it was probably just the wind catching a branch or an animal rubbing against the door. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was making the sound knew exactly where it was scratching. After a few minutes, it stopped completely. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Nothing, just the wind again, whispering through the trees outside. Eventually, I convinced myself to lie back down. My body felt tight with adrenaline, but exhaustion won, and I drifted in and out of sleep until the faint light of morning crept through the window. When I finally got up, everything looked calm and ordinary. The fire had died, leaving only ash. The woods were silent, covered in a fresh layer of snow. I put on my boots and jacket, deciding to step outside and check for animal tracks by the porch. The moment I opened the front door, my stomach dropped. The scratches were there, deep vertical lines running all the way down the wooden door, from just under the handle to the bottom step. But they weren't claw marks. They were long, uneven grooves, like someone had taken their fingernails and dragged them down the surface, over and over again. The edges of each mark were splintered slightly, as if made with force. There were at least a dozen of them, side by side, and at the very top of the door, faint smudges that looked like fingerprints pressed into the wood. For a few seconds I just stared, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was still that maybe it was an animal, maybe a bear had tried to get in. But bears didn't leave marks like that, and certainly not in the middle of winter when they were hibernating. Raccoons had small claws. Coyotes didn't stand upright to reach that high. These marks were different. They looked human. The shape of them, the spacing. 5 lines together, a small gap, then another set lower down, as if someone had crouched, dragging their hands downward. The snow on the porch was mostly smooth, except for a few faint depressions near the door, like footprints that had been partially covered by drifting snow. I felt a slow, heavy unease build in my chest. My brain tried to make sense of it in a rational way. Maybe someone had come up here before me. A squatter, a lost hiker, or a drunk hunter wandering through the woods. Maybe they'd mistaken the cabin for shelter, tried to get in, and left when no one answered. That made sense. But it didn't explain the sound I'd heard at night. I checked around the cabin, walking in a slow circle through the snow. There were faint marks leading toward the tree line, shallow impressions that could have been footprints, but they trailed off quickly into untouched snow. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared completely. The woods were silent again. No movement, no birds. Just me, the cold, and those marks on the door behind me. I went back inside, shut the door, and slid the heavy latch across. The marks were right there on the inside of the wood now, level with my eyes. The more I stared at them, the more I noticed how uneven they were. How some lines dug deeper than others, how they seemed to hesitate halfway down before dragging again. Whoever had made them had done it slowly, carefully, as if they were testing the strength of the wood. For the rest of that morning, I couldn't focus on anything. Every creak made me jump. Every gust of wind against the walls made me glance toward the door. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing. By noon, I'd made up my mind to leave early. I packed everything back into my sled, doused the fire, and double-checked the locks. The scratches were still there, bright against the pale wood in the daylight. I took one last look before I stepped off the porch. The hike back to the car felt longer than before. Every sound, branches snapping, snow sliding off trees, made me turn around. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the entire way down. When I finally reached the road, my car was right where I'd left it. No tracks around it except my own from 2 days earlier. I loaded my gear quickly and started the engine, my hands shaking. On the drive home, I kept trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that someone had been up there weeks before, maybe even months, and I just happened to notice the marks now. But I couldn't explain the sound I'd heard that night. It wasn't random and it wasn't old. The slow, steady drag of those nails still played over and over in my head. That night, when I got back to my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing that door, those long, uneven scratches. I knew how they'd sounded, how deliberate they'd been. Whoever had made them wasn't an animal. They were human, and for at least part of that night, they had been standing just inches away from where I slept, running their fingernails down the wood again and again, testing it, maybe waiting to see if it would open. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. It's still there, miles from the nearest road, locked up and quiet. But sometimes, late at night, when I think about it, I wonder if those marks are still visible. If someone else ever goes up there, I hope they notice them before dark. And I hope they keep the door locked tight, because whatever made those scratches once might decide to come back and try again. I had rented the cabin mostly out of impulse. A small, one-room place tucked into the northern edge of a state forest in Oregon. I'd been working too many late nights, glued to screens, and my head felt heavy all the time. I wanted quiet. I wanted something old and far from the rest of the world. The listing said, former fire warden's property, which sounded interesting enough. The photos showed the cabin nestled in the trees with a wide clearing out front and, in the distance, a rusted watchtower on a nearby ridge. The tower was what sealed it for me. I'd always been drawn to those lonely structures, tall and skeletal against the horizon. Reminders of a time when someone used to sit there all summer scanning for smoke. When I arrived, the place was even more isolated than I expected. The gravel road ended half a mile before the cabin, and the rest was a dirt trail you had to walk. My cell service vanished about 20 minutes before I got there. The air was cool and dry, heavy with the smell of pine and old rain. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. A single room with a bed, a wood stove, and a table beneath a window that looked out toward the ridge where the tower stood. I could just barely see it through the trees, a dark, thin shape against the lighter sky. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the pit outside, cooked a can of chili, and listened to the woods settle into darkness. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every movement, the crunch of small animals in the leaves, the soft whisper of wind. The tower loomed faintly in the distance, just a black outline now. I remember staring at it for a while before going inside to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, the air in the cabin cold enough to see my breath. I stepped outside and looked toward the ridge. The tower was clearer in the daylight. Tall, rusted, its metal stairs twisting up to a small box-shaped cabin at the top. The distance didn't look too far, maybe a mile or so. I decided I'd hike up there later in the day, just to see the view. The hike wasn't difficult, but it was steep. The trail wasn't marked. I had to cut through patches of brush and climb over fallen logs. The higher I went, the quieter it got. The sounds of the forest thinning out until it was mostly just the crunch of my boots and the sound of my breathing. When I finally reached the base of the tower, I could see how old it really was. The paint had long peeled off the metal, and patches of rust spread up the legs. The stairs groaned when I tested them, but they held. The climb up was slow. I gripped both railings and took each step carefully, the metal vibrating faintly beneath me. About halfway up, I paused and looked back toward the clearing below. Through the gaps in the trees, I could see the roof of my cabin, a small, dark square in the green. It struck me how alone I really was out there. There were no roads nearby, no other houses, just trees and hills stretching in every direction. When I reached the top, I expected the lookout cabin to be empty. Instead, I found the door half open. The wood was swollen from years of rain, but when I pushed it, it gave way with a long, dry squeak. The air inside was still and stale, heavy with dust and something faintly sour, like old food. The room was small, maybe 10 feet across, with windows on all sides. Sunlight filtered through grime-streaked glass, cutting thin lines through the dust floating in the air. There was a small table near one window, and beside it, a rolled-up sleeping bag spread over the floor. Empty cans were stacked in a corner, soup, beans, tuna, all modern brands, not ancient leftovers from the old warden days. Some of them were only partially rusted, the kind of wear that takes a few months, not decades. Someone had been here recently. I looked closer. The sleeping bag was flattened, dirty at the edges, with a thin foam pad underneath. Next to it was an old backpack, torn open and empty, and a small pile of crumpled wrappers. Whoever had stayed here hadn't just passed through. They'd lived up here for a while. Then I noticed the binoculars. They sat on the window ledge facing out toward the forest, their lenses dull with a thin layer of dust. I leaned closer, brushing some of it away, and saw that they were pointed directly toward my cabin. I could see it even without the lenses, the angle lined up perfectly with the clearing below. A chill crept through me that had nothing to do with the air. I picked up the binoculars and looked through them, focusing on the cabin. The view was clear. I could see the porch, the fire pit, even the woodpile I'd stacked beside the wall. It felt invasive, standing there, realizing that someone had spent time here watching me. I set the binoculars down and looked around the small room again. In the dust on the table were faint handprints. A few days old, maybe. The sleeping bag didn't look freshly used, but it hadn't been abandoned long either. The cans, the food wrappers, it all looked like someone had packed up and left recently. I thought about the first night, about how I'd sat outside by the fire in plain view of that tower. If someone had been up here with those binoculars, they would have seen everything I did. Every move, every small routine. They might have watched me eat, watched me walk around before bed, even watched the light go out in the cabin window. The thought made my stomach twist. I checked the rest of the room quickly, trying to make sure no one was still there. In the corner, there was a plastic water jug half full, and next to it, a small pile of cigarette butts pressed into a tin lid. No fresh ash, but no signs of weathering either. Whoever it was, they'd probably left within the last week or two. I stepped back out onto the platform and looked down the stairs. The woods felt different now, too quiet, too still. I scanned the tree line, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone watching back. The only thing I could hear was the faint creak of the tower swaying slightly in the breeze. On the way down, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was holding something just out of sight. The idea that someone had been there long enough to set up camp made the entire place feel wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about those binoculars, how they'd been aimed right at my window. When I got back to the cabin, I walked straight around the perimeter, scanning the ground. At first, I didn't see anything, but near the back, behind the woodpile, I found a few footprints in the dirt. Faint but clear enough boot treads, not mine. They led around the side of the cabin and stopped near the trees. There were cigarette butts there too, half buried in the soil. That was when it really hit me. Whoever had been living up there hadn't just been watching from the tower. They'd been close enough to see the cabin from the ground. Maybe close enough to approach it while I was asleep inside. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't turn on the lamp either. I sat by the window in the dark, listening. Every crack of wood or rustle of wind outside made my pulse jump. At one point, I thought I saw a faint glimmer of light up near the ridge. Not bright, just a dull flash, like someone striking a match. I told myself it could have been a trick of the eyes, but I didn't move from that chair until dawn. In the morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even finish breakfast. I strapped everything into the car and didn't look back at the tower as I drove away. A week later, after I got home, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the property's history online. The watchtower, as it turned out, hadn't been used officially since 1998. There was no caretaker assigned to it, no one authorized to be there. The last maintenance record was more than a decade old. I thought about calling the ranger station to report what I'd found, but the truth was I didn't want to explain it. It would have meant admitting how unsettled I'd been, how that feeling of being watched had burrowed under my skin. So I left it alone. But even now, I can't stop picturing it. The tower standing there over the forest, quiet and empty, or maybe not. The dusty sleeping bag, the empty cans, the binoculars still pointed toward that same small clearing. Maybe whoever was living there moved on to another ridge, another patch of woods. Maybe they're still out there watching someone else now. And sometimes late at night when I wake up suddenly and don't know why, I think about that faint flash of light I saw near the tower, that small glimmer like someone had just struck a match to see more clearly what they were looking at.